Welcome to the second video for topic 2. I apologize for the abrupt ending to the last one, but I'm still trying to get used to the technology, and I had meant to press pause, but I accidentally pressed stop. So you'll have to bear with me as I'm learning how to use this over the course of the term. So let's come back and finish the first part of our topic. We were up to slide number 16. So this particular accounting standard that we have been looking at in the first recording talks about provisions, and it talks about another type of liability called a contingent liability, which we're going to have a look at now. So contingent liabilities will arise in a number of specific circumstances. So firstly, it could be that we have a possible obligation. So a possible obligation is one where we are not sure whether or not there is a present obligation. And remember, the first criteria for recognition of a liability is that there has to be a present obligation. So if we're not sure whether there's a present obligation, we have what's called a possible obligation. So a possible obligation is one where there has been a past event, but where the existence will be confirmed by something happening that is outside of our control. So let me give you an example to demonstrate this. Let's assume that I am working for a company who manufactures heaters for people to use within their homes. And the company has just recently sold a heater to a customer. And unfortunately, a few days after selling the heater, unfortunately, the customer's house burnt down. Now, the customer has come to the company and said that they think that the reason their house burnt down was because the heater that we had sold them was faulty, and therefore they wanted compensation. So we obtain access to the heater, we undertake some testing on the heater, and we can't find any fault with it. So we go back to the customer and we say, listen, we're incredibly sorry that your house has burnt down. However, we don't think that we are responsible. We don't think we have a legal obligation in this case. We think that the fire was caused by something else. So the customer, in response to this, has said that they're going to take us to court. They're confident that it was our heater's fault. They're going to take us to court and they're going to sue us for damages. So this is an example of where we have a possible obligation. We have denied responsibility, but the other party has decided to go to court. So the matter now essentially has been taken out of our hands. We are now waiting for a judge to make a finding and make a decision. The judge is either going to decide that we were responsible, in which case that we do have a present obligation, or the judge is going to decide that we were not responsible and therefore there is no present obligation. The decision that the judge makes is outside of our control. So that's the first example of where we could have what's called a contingent liability. The second, or another way in which a contingent liability could arise, is if we have got a present obligation, but where we don't recognise the liability because we can't reliably measure the amount. So let me give you an example of that one. We'll think about our previous example with a heater. But in this case, let's imagine that when we took the heater for testing, we did in fact discover that the heater was faulty. So we are reasonably confident that in fact it was our heater that caused the fire, which means we have a present obligation to make some type of compensation to the customer. So we go back to the customer and we say, look, we're incredibly sorry, and yes, the heater was faulty, so we would like to offer you $100,000 in compensation. The customer comes back and says, no, we want $2 million. So we know there's a present obligation. We know there's going to be an outflow, but at this point in time, we can't reliably estimate the amount because we've offered 100,000, the customer's asking for 2 million, which means the amount at this stage cannot be reliably estimated. I cannot recognize anything in my balance sheet or in my statement of financial position, but I have what's called a contingent liability. The third way in which a contingent liability can arise is because I have a present obligation, but it is not probable that there will be an outflow. So remember, something has to have a likelihood of more than 50% to be probable. So I do have a present obligation, but it's not probable. If it's not probable, I don't recognize a provision, but it can give rise to a contingent liability. These ones here, where there's a present obligation which is not probable, these ones are less common than the other two types of contingent liabilities. And we're talking about very unusual examples. So, for example, if I have the possibility of expropriation of my land from the government, and if I'm going to incur a loss in the event that that happened, I could have a contingent liability. So as you can say, highly specific and not particularly common. Most of the contingent liabilities that we will come across will be either because we have only a possible obligation or because we have a present obligation, but we are not able to reliably measure. So at this point, it may be helpful for us to go back to our original recognition criteria. Okay, so if we look here, if we do not have a present obligation, but rather we have a possible obligation, it results in a contingent liability. If it is not probable, then it could be a contingent liability. And if we cannot reliably estimate, then it could be a contingent liability. So we do not have a provision in our statement of financial position if we fail any of these recognition criteria. However, we could have a contingent liability instead. So contingent liabilities are not recognized in our financial statements. They are, however, disclosed in the notes. Now, we don't necessarily disclose all contingent liabilities in our notes. We only disclose those where the outflow is likely to be material and the likelihood is higher than remote. So we've got a whole range of different terminology throughout this standard to describe different levels of likelihood. So if we look at the diagram at the bottom, we already talked about this idea of whether something is probable. So if the likelihood is more than 50%, it's probable. If the likelihood is less than 50%, it's not probable. But if the likelihood is very unlikely, then it's referred to as remote. So we know that probable is more likely than not. So we know that the distinction between something being probable or not probable is 50%. We can measure that. Unfortunately, the standard doesn't tell us when something moves from being not probable to being remote. We can't quantify it in terms of 5%, 10%, 20%. We're not sure. We have to use our judgment. So in the real world, this can be very complicated, and companies have to be able to determine this distinction between remote or not probable. For you in exams, we generally try and be quite specific. So we use this terminology remote or not probable or probable, for example. We use this terminology to make sure that there's clarity for you. So a contingent liability will not be recognised in the statement of financial position, but it will be disclosed if the likelihood is higher than remote on the basis that it's material. So what you can see on this slide here is a flowchart that helps you to work out the appropriate classification of different types of transactions. And you can see all of the terminology that we've been using in our previous slides incorporated into this slide. So we start here. If we have a present obligation, if we have a probable outflow and it can be reliably estimated, then it says we are going to provide. Okay, in other words, we're going to recognise a provision in our statement of financial position or balance sheet. If it is either a possible obligation or it's not probable or it cannot be reliably estimated, then we're going to disclose a contingent liability in the notes. If we don't meet any of the criteria, then we're going to ignore it and do nothing. So I want you to take a couple of minutes. I want you to use the flowchart here and the concepts that we've looked at in the earlier slides. And I want you to have a look at the next two slides. There are some practical examples here. So I want you to press pause, have a look at slide 19 and 20. Have a go at filling in the table on slide number 20. And when you're ready, press play again, come back and we'll talk about them together. Okay. So transaction number 1. Okay, I've just noticed a minor typo there. Just the dates should read 20XO. So if you can just change those couple of dates there from 2015 to 20XO. Apologies for that, but amongst everything going on this term with having to do everything remotely, we've also had to move on to a new textbook. So all of these slides are brand new for this term. So maybe that there's a couple of little gremlins that have gotten through our review process. So my apologies for that minor error there. Okay, so first one, amount of $35,000. The services have already been provided during May XO. So in this case, this transaction is going to be recognised as a liability. If the services have been rendered, then presumably it means they've received an invoice, and so the amount and the timing is known, and therefore it will be recorded as a trade creditor. Okay, the next one. They're estimating that they're going to incur $26,000 to relocate an employee to another office. The staff member will physically relocate in July. So at the 30th of June, there is no provision or liability. This is a future cost. Nothing has happened yet. There is no present obligation. This is a planned transaction, but there has been no obligating event yet, and they could avoid this expenditure by changing their mind, for example. So no provision or liability in this case. Okay, number 3. The company is planning on recognising a provision of $50,000 for overhauling a machine. The overhaul takes place every 5 years, and the machine is currently 5 years old, so it's due for its overhaul. Again, there is no provision or liability here. There is no present obligation. The company may have their own internal accounting policy here, but there is no legal requirement, there is no legal obligation, and there is no constructive obligation because there are no other external parties involved in this decision. The company could simply decide to sell the machine and replace it with a new one. So even though they have the intention of undertaking this expenditure, there is no obligating event, and they do have realistic alternatives available to them. Therefore, there is no liability. Okay, now the next one. So in this case here, we have a present obligation. The judge has already announced that the company is going to be awarded damages. So there is a present obligation. But the judge hasn't yet advised about what the penalties will be. And the lawyers are currently estimating that it could be anything from 20,000 to 7 million. So even though we know there's a present obligation, we cannot reliably measure it. Because it is unable to be reliably measured, it means it has to be disclosed as a contingent liability in our notes. Okay, so that brings us to the end of the first topic within our week 2 materials. There are some more examples of other transactions like this that you will consider when you look at your homework, and a lot more practical calculations that we're going to go through when we actually go through the homework questions in class next week. The next video is going to talk about employee benefits, which is the second topic within our week 2 materials.